So welcome everybody. Another Tech Talk Tuesday. We're going to talk APIs as usual, but specifically we're going to talk API analytics. What does that mean? It's a pretty broad topic. So here to help me again is Layer 7 CTO Scott Morrison, and we're going to just open up a general discussion about things you need to consider if you're a publisher, things you need to consider when you're the developer or you're starting an API program. So analytics, I mean, like anything in business, I suppose, if it's worth publishing or worth doing, it's worth measuring. So so we're just going to discuss some of the things that you need to think about as you publish or develop with your APIs. So I'll just go over to Scott and have him kind of like generally introduce the topic. Well, I know it takes a little bit of time for people to log in. You're just getting settled in at your desk or whatever. So don't forget to, if you're on Facebook, click the check-in and chat. If you want to come and go, you can always tweet questions. The hashtag is @Layer7Live. And if you're in live stream, some people can't have Facebook certain places in the work environment. So you can just go to the Layer 7 live stream and watch the stream there and chat as well. So Scott, API analytics.
Great, Stephen. Thanks a lot. So I'm Scott Morrison, the CTO of Layer 7. And as Stephen said, what we're going to do today is basically talk about the whole idea of analytics. And that's an interesting thing in the context of APIs, because really, in the end, it's all about information, and information is power. The more you know about how they're being used, the more you know about how every one of these transactions is going through your system, the more you know about the characteristics of your load, who's doing what and when, the better position you're in to charge. But more importantly, I think, the better you know about, or the more you know about your applications, the better position you're in to be able to monetize them effectively and really kind of move forward with an effective API strategy. So really, in the end, it's fundamentally all about that information. It's about making sure that you can capture that information and dice it and slice it the way you need it. And nobody is going to need it in exactly the same way. And that's going to be one of the big things that we're going to talk about today.
So just sort of in a general sense, there's probably different levels of people understanding and logging in. So what are the key metrics publishers should consider once they open up their API? Sort of in general, like what are the kind of the main metrics that they should be measuring?
It's a really good question, and the first thing that everybody gives you, like if you have an API solution like Layer 7's API portal, it's basically going to be telling you initially the simple stuff like basically what your access rates are on a particular API and what your failure rates are. That's sort of the bare minimum that kind of everybody gives you right away. And if you're a developer, for instance, on let's say the client side, that's actually really interesting, because here's a scenario. Like suppose I'm building some app in iOS. Okay, so I'm an Objective-C programmer. I'm building some really cool app for my iPhone and iPad and such. And I'm making use of a bunch of APIs that some organization is hosting and making available to me. Now, typically what would happen is I would engage in some kind of relationship through a developer portal, with that organization to be issued keys and that, so I can access, that API. And those keys are really fundamentally used to track not me, not the user of that app, but they're actually used really to be tracking the application itself. And of course, bear in mind that that application is going to be replicated many, many times all over. So once I push that out there, like once I package that app together, I put it on the iTunes store, Apple gives me the thumbs up and says, yeah, it's okay, it's going out there. And suppose I give it away for free. What's important to me as a developer is to be able to look and see what the access rates are there, and moreover what my failures are. So in other words, if I'm seeing a lot of failed transactions, that's actually impacting my users. So that matters to me a lot. I really care about that, because that means something is going wrong, either in the way my transactions are being fired from my client, my iOS application, or else maybe there's something weird going on with the API provider. So that's important information, really.
So you want to know if it's something, if you're the developer, you want to know if it's something on your side in your code,
exactly.
Or if it's on the publisher side?
Yeah.
Okay.
So and that's the first part of that dialogue, really, that starts to happen between a provider of APIs and a user, a consumer of APIs. Now suppose I go through everything and I realize, I'm getting a lot of, failed transactions here. I have no idea why this is happening. It doesn't seem to be on my side. I think it's something weird on the provider side. At least then I can begin to open that dialogue. And again, the whole point of having things like API portals is to create that dialogue, that linkage between me as a developer and the provider itself. Now contrast that with what a provider wants, okay? A provider has a very different perspective because they want to see the big picture of what's going on. They want to be able to zero in on a couple of different things and dice and slice the information a little differently. They want to know, number one, what's the overall, rate of access into an API. So not just my application, but maybe the dozen or so different applications that are out there. Some are iOS, some are Android applications. Some might actually be, quite literally B2B style applications, business partners, coming into that API. They want to know what's the big picture of that because, in the back end, you've got a .NET server, which starts to get a little sketchy at about, 10,000 transactions a second. And so you want to know what's the overall picture of traffic coming into that system so you can manage that effectively. Because remember, if you're a provider, your game is very much about that, providing a service and getting it out there. So
the rate of access is how many developers or how many calls?
Again, it comes down to how many transactions. But then you may want to slice it further. You may want to go down further and further and reveal more specific information. So let's say you're getting a problem with you're seeing a lot of failed transactions coming through the system. You as a provider want to know, okay, who is that? Is that because one particular application's gone rogue, or does that mean that for some reason I'm having problems as a provider? So I want to be able to dig in not just to a particular API, like let's say my order entry API. But I want to dig in there and find out where those log fails are coming from, or where those transaction fails are coming from. Are they coming from, for instance, one particular application, one particular client, or is it evenly distributed across everybody? So again, different perspectives on the data. Some of the data, of course, that's in there isn't only relevant to you as a provider, and you don't want to make that available to the outside world. So much of what analytics is about is really keeping the data, making sure you have the right data, and then making sure that the views of the data are appropriate to be consumed for that audience. Because really, information is power. You don't necessarily want to reveal too much to people who don't deserve to get that information, don't deserve to get that power.
So the access to the data is another kind of level of...
You bet.
Okay.
Authorization on analytics is one of the things that people tend to overlook a lot. They just say, oh, blanket, you can dig in and everybody gets to see, the consolidated access into an API, plus, they can dig into any particular API key and do a query to find out, what the access is there. Absolutely not. That's there's no way a client-side developer should see another developer's access profile. Because, the truth is, you can tell a tremendous amount about, an application from looking at how it communicates. Just as you can tell a lot in how we communicate as humans, you can tell a lot about how API applications communicate, over the APIs. In fact, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody who does a tremendous amount of API development in London about 2 or 3 months ago. And they were saying they're actually moving away from unique identifiers like API keys for a very good reason. It's because they found that they could identify and characterize particular apps coming into their APIs simply based on the characteristics of how they call the APIs. And so they didn't actually need this, this opaque identifier that said this is coming in from application, ABC, which is an iPhone application. They could derive all of that and basically get the same kind of information that they needed for their analytics simply by looking at the pattern of calls, which I actually thought was very, very interesting, actually. It gets a lot into, almost the kind of approach that people do with threat detection and the potential for threat prevention by looking at signatures again of traffic and deriving what kind of traffic you're actually getting.
Okay. I think we've got a question through Twitter. Well, I don't think we do. I know we do, but I think it might be going back to something you kind of mentioned quickly about errors. So Boris Pavlov asks, is there a way to correlate backend errors with specific API keys using Layer 7?
Oh, listen, absolutely. That was a really important part of the whole thing. So again, if you're on the client side, you can certainly see the information for the keys you own. So, for instance, suppose I'm a client side developer, and I'm building iPhone apps, and Stephen here is building completely different apps he's a different developer. He's building Android apps and stuff like that. I should never be able to see information associated with the keys that have been issued to him, even if for some reason I get access to one of his keys. Like, let's say I reverse engineer one of his apps and find that little key in there, which is quite frankly not that hard to do. I still shouldn't be able to submit that and say, I want to see key, the information for key 123 associated with Stephen. There should still be a level of authentication. Am I allowed to use that key, as a developer and get access to that information? Now, switch it around for a moment. Go from the client side to the server side. Now, the server side guys own the resource, so they should get to see everything. They're the people who should get to drill in and say, I own this resource, I get to see who's accessing what. So they should be able to see Stephen's access and drill down onto that, or Scott's access and drill down onto that. And that's very, very much one of the important design principles that we put into our API portal to make sure the right people can get access to the right information. Yeah, good question, Boris. Really good question.
Is that on Twitter?
Facebook.
Oh, okay. So we've got another question coming in, and just remind everybody too, we've been talking for a few minutes, and I realize that it takes some time to kind of log in and get organized, maybe get your coffee or whatever. So just remind everybody that the hashtag, if you want to tweet questions, is hash Layer7Live, and otherwise we're taking them through the stream on live stream and Facebook. And we've got a Facebook question from Matt Hava. I'm sorry if I've got your name wrong. What is the overhead / latency introduced on the system? I guess going through a portal.
That's another excellent question, actually, and one that you should really consider, when you're looking at all of these things, because the minute you put an intermediary between, a client and a server, it's going to add something. There's no free lunch in this world when it comes to that kind of thing. So the thing to consider is how can you minimize that? And actually, that's one of the things that we really wanted to surface, to the users, whether it's the client-side developers or the server side guys who own that resource. Latency was something that we wanted to be able to surface up to them, because latency is very much a factor in a lot of ways of how sophisticated your processing is of any transaction in flight. So here at Layer 7, we spend an awful lot of time trying to absolutely optimize the flight of a transaction through the system. And so, best case possible, there's almost unmeasurable latency. Like it's really, really low if you're just doing simple reverse proxy, okay? And the system is, under reasonable load, but not ridiculous load. Obviously, as you start to hammer it and have, thousands of sockets open, things like that, like I say, there's nothing for free. You will start to see a certain amount of degradation. But it's important to be able to manage that effectively. So as you begin to add more sophisticated processing into your system, like a good example would be if you're doing OAuth 1.0a and you're having to actually validate OAuth tokens that have signatures in them, that ain't free. That you have to go through there and start to look at your mappings between parameters, and there's a fair amount of inspection and validation there. It's still extremely fast, but you're going to add a little more. So one of the things that we did is surface exactly that latency information, both to the client-side developer but also to the server-side developer, so they can tune and also look for spikes, so they can see, if again, me as a client-side developer, if I'm seeing that, I just, at certain times of the day, like, right around dinner time, I'm finding my app just is sluggish. The user experience isn't great. I can begin to delve into the analytics for that and see, oh, you know what? There seems to be, a huge spike in latency with certain transactions that I'm actually calling, over the dinner hour. Now, what does that mean? And then I can begin to create a dialogue with the service provider and say, why am I seeing that? Why am I seeing a problem?
come back. We've lost our internet connection.
Oh,
Try
okay.
to connect again. Sorry.
So it's still recording. I'll just stop now.
Yeah.
Go.
Okay, we'll just reset it. So we're back live. Sorry, everybody.
That was latency. I don't know how much you guys lost of that. It's too bad. And you know, the always connected universe isn't always connected, I guess.
This is true. We'll just have to. Sorry, everybody's going to have to kind of re-log in, so that might take a minute or two, and we'll backtrack just a bit. I've got another question kind of in the queue from Twitter, and if maybe Scott can kind of review what his answer was around latency.
Okay.
Kind of go over that again, just in case.
That's great. You know what? I actually like getting a second chance with this kind of stuff sometimes because it lets me you know, hit the important points. So here are the big things you got to remember. We spent a lot of time at layer 7 making sure that we could minimize latency as much as possible. An important design point of the whole, you know, secure span gateway line was to be able to process streams of communication, regardless of what they are. They could be streams of you know, RESTful APIs using JSON, or even like a SOAP message over you know, MQ series or something like that. Regardless of what it is, though, our processing model, you know, tries to pipeline this stuff through as efficiently as possible. But that said, as you begin to do more and more sophisticated processing, more sophisticated policies are applied to it, obviously you're going to increase latency. But what's important then is to be able to understand what the ramifications are of adding certain additional, you know, processing steps. And a good example is something like OAuth 10A, where you actually have signatures that you've got to validate that can actually cross and encompass parameters within a query, like a get or something like that. Now, of course, that was, people moved away from that and made it optional within 2.0, simply because it was hard to do and expensive and that. But still, there are a lot of applications which do that for very, very good reason. That ain't for free, okay? So, like, whenever you do signature validations or any kind of crypto, it can be extremely fast. And you know, I'm proud to say the guys upstairs in our R&D department have spent a lot of time making it like blistering fast. But nevertheless, you add a little bit. So you've got to consider all of these little bits of additional processing. So here's the thing, is suppose I'm a developer and I, you know, build some cool app on my iPhone, and I'm finding at a certain point it's really getting draggy, like you know, at dinner time it seems to, the user experience just goes into the toilet. I can then go back to the portal and say, you know what, I want to look at what over time the latency profile is. So not just the fails and things like that, but I want to see what the latency profile on the gateways and the back end are, because I think that's what's affecting, you know, my app's behavior during certain time periods, and I can correlate that against you know, let's say certain other events on the internet and things like that, and try to figure out where the issue is. So it may be that there's too much policy being applied or something, and maybe I have to streamline and work with the provider to streamline the processing a little more. Or maybe I go back to the provider and say, guys, for some reason around 6 p.m. all the time, this is the latency I'm seeing, and they'll go look at the same data and go, oh wow, that's weird. Let's look at our end and figure out, you know, what's going on. And maybe they find that, you know, on their internal network, you know, a backup fires, you know, on a subnet every day at 6 p.m. or something like that, and suddenly starts to flood one of their internal networks, which slows the whole thing down. You know, things like that happen all the time. You're in the game of integration. If you're in APIs, you're doing integration. Like, I mean, much as you like to think that we're doing everything differently and in fact we are, the truth is, in the end, integration is a muddy slog. It's as muddy today as it was, you know, 25 years ago when we were trying to do things like with homemade protocols and things like that. It's about, you know, adapting this to that and somehow trying to get these things together. We have better protocols and better approaches in RESTful APIs and, you know, data encapsulations like JSON, and we have, you know, way better identity approaches with things like OAuth and OpenID Connect and such. But in the end, it's still a complex problem, and it's about tuning things together to make it all link up together. So, and a part of that whole equation is latency. And the more you know about the latency and the more you can monitor that through time, but also get an idea of what your latency profiles are, the better user experience and the better integration you'll end up doing.
Great. So I hope everybody was able to get back logged in. Sorry about that. Still have a couple of questions in the queue from Twitter, it looks like. Dick Wilson asks, does each application get a separate key?
Yeah, so each application, this is actually a really important point because people don't get API keys in a lot of cases, I find. There's a tremendous amount of confusion and out there in the community about what the value of an API key and how it gets associated with, with what. I've actually had a lot of people, start to look at an API key as the new security token for a user. And truth be told, nothing could be further from the truth. It should never really be associated with the user. API key is not even the word itself isn't great because it sort of suggests that it's the key to an API for what? It's really an application key, and that's why that's such an important and such a good question, is because really you think of an API key as a particular application's access into a particular API. So it's that linkage between, let's say, the cool iPhone app that I build as a developer and its usage of maybe not just one API, but maybe several APIs. Because you can gang up usage of an API key across several different APIs that actually maybe go back to one particular app. And there's very good reasons for doing that, by the way. So that association is actually really, really important. But here's the other thing. It should never really be considered an authoritative identifier. And the reason is exactly what I said before, which is what people tend to do with API keys is that they, these things are long, opaque strings of hex digits and that. So they get copied and pasted and burned into an app. That's not secure. In the end, people can always reverse engineer that and decompile that and capture that key again. So you should never consider that key as valuable as, say, a username or password, which is something like something public like a username, and then something that's in your head that you don't reveal to people. And even that, by the way, is as we all know, is not a great security model.
Yeah.
Hello, look at the problems that LinkedIn had just this week over issues like that. But an API key is even worse, so you should never consider an API key an authoritative identifier. It's there for tracking purposes, okay? It's there for being that magical piece that sort of associates the transaction with an application for purposes of analytics. It gets dicier when it gets into charging because, again, it's not hard to capture and spoof an API key. So you got to ask yourself some real hard questions here about the overall security model of API keys and how those should be associated with other things. So a lot of the reason that people associate things like shared secrets and that with API keys, which are very often kept separately from them, and maybe in some cases made simple enough that a human or somebody can activate them, which makes a lot of sense under certain circumstances. It's a big open question right now. It gets into the old, if computers talk to other computers, how do what tokens do they use? And we've had that problem for a lot of years, and it's not going away soon.
Great. Another kind of metric question through Twitter. What are the key business metrics for APIs? We've sort of been talking about the technical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How about operational metrics?
Yeah, okay. So, KPIs, as they call them, the key performance indicators. In a lot of cases, it gets down to those basic ones about who's accessing what and when. So the most important thing that a device like Layer 7's API gateway and portal can really do is capture that key information and consolidate it effectively, so that a couple of important things. The API that's being called, the application that's calling it, and moreover, you also know, if you can possibly get it, the identity of the person who's using that API. Because that's an important piece of that whole puzzle. So that's what distinguishes the same application being used by Scott versus Stephen versus Jose versus anybody else, and that, because we could all be using that same application. We could all be using the same Hootsuite app or something like that on our iPhones. But it's important that each one of us have a sense of that that individual identity, so that obviously the right information can be delivered to the right person at the right time. I don't want to be able to post on, or you don't want me to be able to post obviously on your Twitter, and vice versa.
Right.
So this is the interesting thing today, is that we've got this sense of multiple layers of authentication and identification. So it's not just about user to computer. It's about user, human being, and client-side app, so app as well. Maybe even device, because that's, again, interesting information. Maybe even device location. Maybe even time of day, like other kinds of metadata. All of this is grist for the mill in making access control decisions. Is a transaction going to get to where it's going to go? So, and moreover, all of that information should be, recorded in one way or the other, because it's potentially useful as a key performance indicator. Because here's the secret. Here's the really, really important thing I want to leave you with, is that everybody wants something different. Okay, there's the basic stuff that everybody needs in API analytics, which is the basic information about for a particular API, for a particular API key, who what the traffic profile and latency in that is. That's just baseline stuff. What's also, though, important is the stuff that is going to be different for everybody. So one provider is going to want to know exactly, when a certain class of users is accessing a particular API. And I, as a vendor, I can't anticipate that. I'll do my best to anticipate it, but truth is, it's one of those many-to-many problems. So here's what I do, and my approach to that is to make all of that underlying data available so it can be extracted and diced and sliced any way you want. And that's really the secret to, that's the BI secret. The BI secret really, in the end, the business intelligence thing has always been about everybody wants something different in analytics. Everybody has an opinion. There may be a lot of overlap, and you can always create a few basic screens that tell you a lot. But in the end, you've got the problem of this particular executive wants it, in blue, and this particular executive wants it in red. It may all derive from the same data, but in the end, there's a lot of customization there. So the secret is to make that data as available as possible, and that's one of the things that we've worked a lot on, is to be able to export that data, make it available through APIs, be able to get it out, let's say, into a classical BI system, if you happen to have one, put it into a star schema so that the classical BI guys can dice it, slice it, cut it up 9 ways from Sunday, and do whatever they want with it. At the same time, create the basic interfaces and that everybody needs all the time, that baseline stuff, and make it extensible so that it's pretty easy to actually add, new views in there. That's the real secret to API analytics. Keep track of that key information.
Great. So again, hopefully I'm not ruining your name. Madhava Krishna Maduri has kind of a follow-up question to the latency, I think. When possible, please explain your thoughts on using this, which I think it refers back to latency, along with a caching scenario or a CDN like Akamai Edge. Is there a plugin that does the job?
Yeah, really, really good question again. Yeah, this is a good one actually. We're getting a lot of really good feedback from the internets. That's actually, in the API world, that's a really, really interesting problem right now, because it really gets to the heart of the sort of the overlap and the non-overlap between classical web and the API world. So I think caching is tremendously important. The greatest performance advancements we've had in computing, bar none, have been about caching. Caching down at the chip level, at the bus level, at the internet level, just anywhere you look in computing, the biggest bang for the buck has always been in good and smart use of caching. And I give tremendous credit to the the inventors of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee and Al Gore, but for thinking about the caching problem, coming up with a protocol in HTTP, which I'm sure was Al's invention, that acknowledged and worked well in a caching scenario, and companies like Akamai are testaments to the fact that a lot of stuff can get cached and in fact pushed out to the edge. But here's the problem, is that that's great for very static content and gets and things like that, which are truly idempotent. So in other words, you can do them again and again and again and again, and the result doesn't change. APIs tend not to be like that. the reason we're doing APIs is because we're doing something of value which changes a lot, and the parameters very often can't always get mapped into something that's idempotent. In theory, GET should always be like that. Good RESTful practice says that GET should always be idempotent, and we should be able to, push them out onto a CDN or something like that, or, cache them locally on a gateway, like, again, what we do, certainly in our API portal and our API proxy gateway, is we have caching in there so that you can identify your own caching models and things like that. Hold that thought, more on that later. But the truth is, so much of what people do in the API world is not really cacheable, and shouldn't be cacheable, because so much of what they're doing actually is posts where you're actually affecting change on some back-end server as a side effect, and so you really can't cache that effectively, and you really can't really push it out and distribute it very well on a CDN. In those cases where you do have something that's truly idempotent, great. Fill your boots, by all means, cache as much as you can, and to come around to, I think, the underlying point of that question is, does that screw up your analytics? To a certain extent, it will, because of course, if somebody's going through a CDN and it doesn't necessarily go through your gateway, you're never going to see that kind of activity, and it's it's an issue that is in a lot of ways still kind of open. What you can do is instrument CDNs to a certain extent, so that you can begin to integrate a centralized gateway so it can mine the CDN information, because the CDN information is keeping all of that as well. So that that information is certainly available and can be consolidated in, and we've, interestingly enough, we've done some scenarios with a couple of our customers very, very similar to that. So in a sense, the central information store, that API portal, has to be able to reach out to the touch points and to third-party CDNs, because let's face it, nobody's going to build their own CDN now. There's companies that do it really, really well and pull that information back in and make that an important part of that whole equation. Now, the only other thing let me mention is I did say something about tuning caching, right. And much as I love the caching model on the internet, and as much as I advocate working within it, and working within the whole model of caching through through HTTP headers and that, sometimes it's really great to be able to override that, and you can get a lot of value out of having a priori knowledge of what's going on in your back ends to sort of cut to the chase a little more. And we've done some really interesting things within our policy language where you can tune and cache anything, like any objects within that transaction, and information that you're getting back from back ends you can cache. Where that really matters is when you begin to do interesting orchestrations. So let's say your front-end proxy, your API proxy, is actually a facade for multiple back-end queries. In other words, it's mashing up a bunch of stuff. This might be a SOAP query over here. This might be talking to a legacy mainframe using Kix transactions. This one might be talking to a RESTful transaction into a much more modern system. But all of it is being orchestrated together. Like all those transactions might fire off simultaneously and rendezvous back. They get mined for the results, and all of that's packaged up nicely to a nice little JSON payload, and that JSON goes back to the client. So in other words, you're creating an orchestrated facade of back ends. You can do some really interesting things with overriding the standard caching there, because obviously some of those back ends are not subject to the rules of the internet, and build some very, very effective caching. And that all gets, of course, worked into the calculations of overall latency on the gateway itself.
Great.
It's very cool. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that.
Yeah.
That could be, actually, we should talk about that. That would be a great,
sure.
One of these tech talks actually about caching strategies. Now, I know we had an earlier one that talked a little about that, but that's a really important topic. How to do caching effectively in the API
we can set
world.
that up for the summertime, for sure. So we hope that answers your question. There's another one here in the queue, and I'm just going to ask everybody if you have any kind of final questions for Scott, try to tweet them or send them, chat them through the Facebook. We've got a question about open APIs and kind of internal partner stuff. So we'll get Scott to answer that, and then get your final kind of questions in, and then I'll just have got a couple things to announce at the end, and then we'll say thanks. So there's, in terms of analytics, do you think about things differently when you have an open API, like some of the big ones, like Twitter and Google have these great big ones, or internal or partner ones? When you're, enterprise kind of apps. Do you think about those analytics differently?
Yeah, you should in a lot of ways, because let's suppose I'm, let me put my server side hat on. So suppose I'm responsible for my organization's API strategy, and one of the things I'm designing is an effective delivery mechanism for my developers out there in the field to access my resources in my network. And I want to make some external APIs available to those developers. And a good reason for doing that is something like same origin policy. So like suppose those developers are maybe not building mobile apps as much as building web apps where they're doing API queries that both access internal resources but also have to access Google APIs and stuff that breaks out of same origin policies. Now, sure, they can do that with JSON-P. That's one approach. But another approach is actually to also kind of consolidate proxy APIs within something like our API portal. And the benefit of doing that is, once again, myself as the organizational administrator can get control over that in terms of surfacing certain APIs and not surfacing others. Creating new virtual APIs of third-party APIs. And doing things like consolidating authentication, and doing things like creating, a really good monitoring regime of the whole thing. Because of course, if somebody's out there and they're, let's say they're writing an iPhone app and they're calling, Twitter over here and they're calling Facebook over here, and then they call my internal apps. In general, I wouldn't have visibility into that stuff they're doing out of band. Whereas if I funnel it all through my proxy and then go out on their behalf, all of a sudden you can see the whole thing, the whole picture. Now, a lot of developers will say, "Oh God, the last thing I want to do is, is be forced to go through that system." Well, in truth, there's some good reasons for doing that, especially if it's all in one organization. So in other words, it's not a case of reaching out and imposing something on external developers as much as working with internal developers against certain corporate policies. And one of those policies might say, what, we want to consolidate all the activity through one place because it's important to us to see the overall activity of our usage. And so in cases like that, you really do want to be thinking about external access almost like it was internal, and that because you want to impose that control and but impose the control in a good way, in a valuable way. So not the pejorative use of that.
Good. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm just going to mention a couple upcoming events we have. We've got a webinar coming up on June 21st, which is going to be how to make your enterprise applications mobile ready fast, and that features Forrester and Eli Lilly. So that's June 21st.
That'll be good. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one for sure. So make sure you go to layer7.com and go to the webinar and sign up and register.
And by the way, if you're interested in things like key management on iOS devices and how to do secure connectivity from iOS devices, in particular things like iPads into the enterprise, you have to be at that webinar because you'll learn some really interesting stuff.
So June 21st, which may be the first day of summer, sometimes it is. But go to layer7.com and click the webinar link and sign up and join us on the 21st. And then in 2 weeks' time, it's June 26th, and we're going to be doing our next Tech Talk, which is going to be designing flexible APIs. And we've got a special guest for that one that we're really looking forward to, which we'll probably announce on Twitter fairly soon. But yeah, we've got a great guest, June 26th, designing flexible APIs. Again, just come back to layer7.com, check out our events. We've got a Tech Talk page. Yeah, so the two key dates, June 21st and June 26th. And so if there aren't any more questions, really appreciate everybody's interactivity today. And thanks, Scott, again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Scott's the best friend of Tech Talk. Great host, and thanks for answering all the questions.
Sounds good.
Great job.
Okay,
Thanks everybody.